Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here in Gangnam, South Korea, right outside the Starfield Library. And over the last couple days, I've had an opportunity to really learn about Korea and its history, particularly regarding the Korean War. So I went to the War Memorial as well as the DMZ, and these were very interesting experiences, to say the least. When I was at the DMZ, I had the opportunity to meet and ask questions to a North Korean defector and hear about her story coming from North Korea to the South. Um, and as part of the tour guide, I got received a lot of information about the relations between North and South Korea, the history, and the attitude of the South towards the North. And after all these experiences, I actually ended up with more questions than I had initially. To me, it seems like there was something fishy going on. Um, Watching all the videos, hearing the people speak about it, it almost seemed equally as propagandistic as the other side, they're claiming the other side to be. Um, and the biggest question I had after looking at the history of Korea, it really doesn't make sense why the Korean War happened in the first place. Um, and because of this, I dug deeper and did some additional research, and I was able to gain some insight into the true nature of the situation, which I don't think is known by the majority. At least it's not taught in the public education system. So, yeah, the main question is like, why would the Korean War even happen? Because if we look at the history, right, after World War II, Korea gained its independence after 30, 40 years of Japanese colonial rule, and there were many atrocities and terrors during this time. So if there's anything we've learned from human psychology, it's that shared trauma brings people together, right? It forms bonds. So it really doesn't make any sense that these trauma bonded people that have a strong culture, a national identity, and deep familial ties, why would they immediately turn around and fight a bloody war that resulted in the deaths of 3 millions of their own people? So this makes honestly no sense. We would expect the opposite. We would expect these people are united, they're nationalistic, and they're looking to restore the glory of their country. So, and this is actually what we see historically after World War II. We see the rising of people's committees to govern the people, and these are moderate nationalist groups. Um, but then, so what happens that leads to the situation and narrative that we have today, which is we have these two sides, North and South, capitalism versus communism, and these two must fight an ideological war to see who comes out on top. So there are no deep ideological roots for either communism or capitalism before World War II. So the Koreans were not concerned about either of these, right? These people are rice farmers, again, under Japanese colonial rule, and their main concern is just getting their land back from the Japanese, right? The 38th parallel, this line that divides it, is essentially a random line. It was decided on a National Geographic map within like an hour by people from the UN, right? So how does this line become the division line between this country of strong familial bonds and strong shared identity, right? There's no inherent divide in it. So these questions don't really have a satisfactory answer from the common lens, but the thesis that I'm going to put forward is that this divide between North and South Korea and the Korean War was manufactured by ruling elite for profit and control, like most division. So in this case, the goal is to prevent the restoration of a strong, independent, traditional nation of Korea. And instead, they wanted to control Korea and reshape it into vassal states for empire that can be exploited for the energy of the people, because the Koreans are a very energetic people. So from this lens, firstly, this explains the significance of the 30th parallel, right? It isn't random, and it isn't tied to any cultural roots. The reason we're divided between North and South is because in the North, The North holds all the resources, whereas the South holds all the ports and all the agriculture. So when you divide along this way from a geopolitical lens, right now you have two incomplete halves. And in order to be complete, they will always need to rely on foreign support. So this ties them to the empire. Um, so this division is made, but then, how do you prevent, one side from taking over? How do you keep this division to last for eternity? And the way that they did this was through the Korean War. So to start, look at the leadership on both sides of the conflict. So Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee are not really Koreans. So that's the first thing. Kim Il-sung was a captain of the Soviet army, and Syngman Rhee was a U.S. state official who was educated at Princeton and Harvard. So these two are not Koreans, and they never had Korean interests in mind. They're acting as puppets for their respective empires. So they're puppets, and their goal is to polarize the Korean peninsula and escalate the conflict and start the Korean War. And the question is, well, how do you do this, right? Because again, these people, after colonial rule, they should be unified, they should be together, they just went through so much trauma. Now they should be holding hands and rebuilding their communities. So how do you go from that to bloodshed, hate, and division, right? So the first thing you do is you have to eradicate the middle ground, and that's what these two leaders do. You have to get rid of the nationalists, you have to get rid of the people who are interested in unification. Because the Koreans did not care about ideology, they did not care about communism and capitalism, right? These are only brought in through the puppets of the empire. So those who are against the division, who want a unified Korea, these are the common enemy of both sides, of both the DPRK and the ROK. And the biggest example you can see, or one famous example you can see of how they did this, eradicating the middle ground, is in the Jeju uprising. So on Jeju Island, these people were refusing to participate in the May 10th elections that would establish South Korea as a separate country. And because of this, Syngman Rhee and the South Korean government, who are backed by the US military, they turned the island basically into a kill zone. So if you were more than 5 kilometers from the coast, you were labeled as a communist, like an insurgent, and you were to be slaughtered, right? So on Jeju Island, these are coastal people, but all their farming, they're tending their livestock, or some are living in the mountains, so they'd go up to the mountains and they would be killed. And this resulted in the death of about 10% of the island's population. And you might ask, okay, well, did the people not see the government doing this, killing all these local island people? And no, because they did not execute the massacre themselves, right? They brought in a third party to act on their behalf. So, yeah, because they wouldn't trust the local police, they wouldn't trust the Koreans who might side with the island people. So in order to enact this and perform this massacre, they brought in the Northwest League, which is a group of ex-North Korean farmers who had been stripped of their land during the purges under Kim Il-sung. So essentially they bring in all these ex-North Koreans who lost all their land, so they're angry, they've been through trauma, they've lost everything, and they essentially armed them and let them loose on the Southerners in Jeju Island and said, these islanders, they're communists, these are the ones who took your land, right? Because these islanders, they don't want the division and they want their land back. They want land reform, for example. So they were painted to be communists, and then they sent these fanatical ex-North Koreans, angry North Koreans, to go and kill them. So, yeah, in reality, these Koreans, they were not communists, they just wanted peace. They wanted their land back, they wanted land reform, and they wanted unification more than anything. They weren't participating in the election because they did not want a divided Korea. So you might ask, why didn't people look and recognize what was going on and speak up and push against this foreign influence division? Even at this point in time, in the future, this doesn't happen either. And we have to realize that what's happening in this time and during the Korean War is a blood ritual, So this ritual involved every single Korean, right? It had to involve everyone personally so that this divide between North and South would become ingrained in their psyche, their identity, and their soul. And this divide would be passed down from generation to generation. So in the North, we have the landlord purges, where Kim Il-sung goes to the peasants and says, like, okay, go kill your landlord and take his land and take his property. So they do this, and this makes them complicit, right? They're guilty, they've committed murder, they've committed theft. So because of this, because of what you've done in your mind, you are forever going to be tied to the regime, right? You can never turn back once you've committed this sin, this atrocity. So this ties you forever to the regime, because if the South ever comes into power, right, you're going to be tried. You're going to be tried for your crimes. You're going to be hanged for murder. In the South, the U.S.-backed government under Ri, they're rounding up and killing everyone who is signing land reform petitions or joining labor unions, right? Under the guise of eradicating the communists, eradicating the leftists, and defending capitalism and freedom. So if you saw this ordeal happening, you survived this ordeal, you now hate the South with essentially religious fervor, and this pushes you into the arms of the North after witnessing what's going on this end. So after all is said and done on both sides, everyone here is now guilty. Everyone in Korea is guilty. Everyone's a criminal, so there's no possibility of a middle ground emerging. No possibility of neutrality or unification. So through these massacres, through these purges, the people become radicalized, polarized to either side, and this leads to the events of the Korean War. And with the war, you have now essentially the propaganda has been set in stone. It's locking the people into a mental prison that will last essentially even to today. So the South is going to tell themselves, well, we're the defenders of freedom and liberty against the tyranny and oppression of the North. And the North is going to tell themselves, like, hey, we're the pure-blooded traditionalists, and we're protecting against the Western imperial values. And this so there's this narrative pushed in the West that all the North Korean citizens are victims, dissidents, and they're just, paralyzed by fear, and they can't rise up against the DPRK. So this idea is probably utter nonsense, just from a logical perspective, looking at the actual historical events that happen and how their psychology changes because of it. So now after 70 years, right, what is the result of this puppet show in this Korean War? Like, what happens after? What was their goal and their motivation? So their goal was this divide, right? And why did they want this divide? This divide is now, it's unresolved even to today. There's no really imaginable future where it will be resolved. And it's because it's essentially been codified into the Korean identity. Because this divide, again, it keeps Korea forever weak, dependent, and it creates essentially the perfect imperial state. So now we look at the South. What happens now? We look at even the South today. We have an extreme consumerist society with the highest suicide rates, the lowest birth rates, hyper-competitiveness, and complete dependence on global corporations. So this is a population that is enslaved by anxiety, and anxiety is the mechanism by which the elite and the empire extract value and energy from the people. And similarly, you look at what's happening in the North, right? This is essentially people frozen in time. They're enslaved to directly by force, and they are forever will serve as a boogeyman, the perfect boogeyman, to justify the eternal presence of the empire, the military-industrial complex in the Pacific, right? So essentially, the Korean War, not only did it never end, it has become Korea itself. So that's where we are today, and this is the conclusion I've come to after looking at the historical facts. And we can also see, like, control of Korea, it was never the actual goal of the Korean War, or to say it wasn't the only goal. It was also a means to an end for a more important project, which is grasp over the East and the Eastern continent as a whole. So if we look, who benefited the most from the Korean War was actually Japan, right? After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and at the end of World War II, Japan was left a ravaged wasteland that, somehow in one decade became an industrial powerhouse, which makes no sense. It's essentially unheard of, right? And if you ask academia, they say like, oh, through sheer willpower and strong individual capacity, they pulled themselves up by their capitalist bootstraps into prominence. But obviously, this is not going to be the case. This cannot be the case. So this resurrection of Japan was not some sort of miracle. This resurrection was actually a blood transfusion from the corpses of the millions of Koreans in the Korean War. So I'll speak a bit more about this in the future. That's all for today.